The stock market is a device for transferring money from the impatient to the patient. You have heard that before. But here is what nobody tells you. The transfer does not happen because of bad timing. It does not happen because of bad information. It happens because of bad emotions. Right now, somewhere in the world, someone just sold an asset in a panic that will double in value within 18 months. Someone just made a financial decision at 11 at night after reading terrible news. Someone just let fear speak louder than strategy. And it cost them everything they built. Maybe that someone has been you. The inability to sit still when everything around you is screaming to move. That is the single most expensive habit in the modern financial world. And Napoleon Hill identified it nearly 100 years ago. He did not call it emotional intelligence. He called it self-mastery. And he taught that without it, no philosophy of wealth, no technique of accumulation, and no strategy of investment would ever hold. Today, you are going to learn the exact silent strategy that made John D. Rockefeller an untouchable billionaire. A man who watched markets collapse, partners panic, and competitors self-destruct, and did almost nothing. Not because he was cold, because he was trained. This is not motivation. This is a system, and it starts right now. Stop and think about the last time fear made a decision for you. It might have been subtle, a sudden drop in value, and you checked your portfolio 14 times in one day. A negative headline, and you pulled back from an opportunity you had researched for weeks. A sharp word from someone you trusted, and your entire strategy collapsed overnight. This is not weakness. This is biology operating without a governor. And Napoleon Hill was one of the first thinkers in modern history to name it, frame it, and give it a financial price tag. In Think and Grow Rich, Hill wrote that the majority of people allow their emotions to override their reason when it comes to money. He identified fear as one of the 6 primary ghosts that haunt the human mind, and he placed the fear of poverty at the very top of that list. Not because poverty itself destroys people, but because the fear of it does. Here is the mathematics of panic that most financial educators will never teach you. When you react emotionally to a market event, you do not simply lose money in that single transaction. You lose 3 things simultaneously. First, you lose the capital you moved or withdrew at the wrong moment. Second, you lose the compound interest and future growth that capital would have generated had it remained in place. Third, and most invisibly, you lose pattern recognition. Your nervous system logs that panic as a survival response that worked, and it will fire that same response faster the next time. This is why emotional reactions do not stay isolated. They become financial habits, and habits, as Hill reminded us, become destiny. Napoleon Hill studied Andrew Carnegie for 20 years before distilling his findings into a single principle: controlled mental attitude. Carnegie did not succeed because he was lucky. He succeeded because when the steel market shook, he sat down. He asked questions instead of issuing commands. He watched his partners, read the room, and studied the faces of the men around him. And then he moved with precision. This is financial stoicism, not the absence of feeling, the refusal to let feeling govern strategy. The Stoics of ancient Greece understood something that Wall Street is still learning. The event itself is neutral. It is your interpretation of the event and the speed at which you act on that interpretation that determines whether the event enriches you or destroys you. Hill built an entire chapter around this. He called it Mastery of the Sixth Sense. But at its foundation, it is simply this: the wealthiest minds in history were not the most intelligent. They were the most emotionally disciplined. That distinction will cost you or reward you for the rest of your life. Pay attention here. This is where the philosophy becomes personal. Napoleon Hill spent time with men who had accumulated more wealth than most nations, and the one pattern he documented with consistency was not ambition. It was stillness. Hill wrote that every act of uncontrolled anger, every moment of sustained fear, and every episode of emotional chaos functions as a drain on the human nervous system. The mind, he taught, operates much like an electrical circuit. When the current is smooth and controlled, power moves efficiently from thought to result. When the circuit is disrupted by emotional turbulence, the energy dissipates. It produces heat instead of light, noise instead of movement. He called this the energy leak. And it shows up directly in your bank account. Consider this. Two people face the same financial setback. The first person spends 72 hours in anger, resentment, and fear. They make 3 reactive decisions. They lose sleep. They damage 2 relationships in conversations that should never have happened. They arrive at the end of the week mentally depleted, financially exposed, and emotionally bankrupt. The second person receives the same news. They feel the impact. They do not suppress it. They sit with it for 24 hours without acting on it. Then they ask one question: what is the most intelligent response available to me right now? And they move from that place. Hill documented this contrast hundreds of times across his research. He found it embodied most completely in John D. Rockefeller. Rockefeller operated during some of the most volatile economic periods in American industrial history. Partners collapsed around him, banks failed, markets swung violently with no warning, and the men who watched him during those moments described the same thing repeatedly: silence. Not indifference, not detachment, deliberate, chosen, weaponized silence. When the panic was loudest, Rockefeller grew quietest. He had trained himself to understand that the moment of maximum fear in a room is also the moment of maximum opportunity, but only for the person who does not participate in the fear. Hill extracted from this a practical tool he called the mental ground wire. Think of it like the grounding rod on a building during a lightning storm. When emotional voltage spikes, when the news hits, when the loss registers, when the threat appears, the ground wire does not stop the electricity. It routes it safely. It prevents the circuit from burning. Your mental ground wire is a pre-decided protocol, a set of internal rules you establish before the crisis arrives, so that when the crisis arrives, your trained mind governs your response instead of your raw emotion. Hill taught that this was not a gift. It was a practice. He wrote that self-discipline is the master key to riches. That key must be forged before the storm, not during it. Here is the remedy, not a concept, a protocol. Napoleon Hill studied the habits of over 500 of the wealthiest and most successful individuals of his era, and from that research he extracted a principle so simple it is almost insulting, and so powerful that most people will never consistently apply it. No major financial decision should be made within 24 hours of receiving bad news. That is it. That is the rule, and it carries the weight of decades of observed human behavior behind it. Hill documented case after case in which fortunes were lost not at the moment of crisis, but in the 12 to 24 hours following the crisis. The market drops. The deal falls through. The partner betrays. And in that window of emotional disruption, a decision is made that compounds the loss by a factor of 10. The 24-hour rule functions as a circuit breaker for the mind. It inserts a deliberate pause between the stimulus and the response. In that pause, according to Hill, lies the entire difference between the person who accumulates wealth and the person who perpetually rebuilds from zero. Now here is where the ancient and the modern converge. The psalmist wrote words that have survived 3,000 years for a reason. Be still and know. 2 words of instruction embedded inside a statement of identity. The psalmist was not writing poetry. He was prescribing a state of being. Be still. That is not passivity. That is the most advanced form of financial and spiritual discipline available to a human being. the ability to remain internally quiet while the world outside generates maximum noise. Hill recognized this principle and spent his life translating it into practical success philosophy. He wrote that the person who can remain calm while others lose their composure holds a form of power that no market can take from them. He called it mental fortitude. The ancient texts called it wisdom. Modern neuroscience calls it prefrontal regulation. The name does not matter, the function does. This is also the foundation of Hill's Mastermind principle, one of the most misunderstood concepts in all of Think and Grow Rich. Most people interpret the mastermind as simply a group of smart people in a room. Hill meant something deeper. He described the mastermind as a third intelligence, a form of collective consciousness that emerges when two or more minds align in harmony toward a common objective. Harmony is the operative word. You cannot contribute to or benefit from a mastermind when your emotional state is chaotic. The frequency at which a panicked mind operates is incompatible with the frequency at which strategic intelligence functions. Hill was explicit about this. Emotional intelligence is not a soft skill. It is the prerequisite to every hard result. Emotionally intelligent leaders attract better partnerships, better opportunities, and better outcomes because they operate from a level of mental coherence that most people only access accidentally and briefly. You can access it intentionally, but only if you respect the law that governs it. Silence is not weakness. Silence is the sound of a superior mind preparing to move. This principle did not die with the industrial age. It compounded. Warren Buffett, a man who has spent decades demonstrating that patience is a financial instrument, built the single most quoted line in modern investing directly from the philosophy that Hill documented. Be fearful when others are greedy, and greedy when others are fearful. That is not a market observation. That is an emotional prescription. It requires the practitioner to operate in direct opposition to the dominant feeling in the room, which is only possible when you are not swept up in it yourself. Earl Nightingale, one of the most important voices in the tradition that Napoleon Hill established, framed it plainly. He taught that the mind moves in the direction of its most dominant thought. If your most dominant thought during a financial disruption is fear, your mind and your money will move toward the very outcome you are trying to avoid. Not mysticism, mechanics. Henry Ford understood this in his bones. Ford was told repeatedly that his vision was impossible. Bankers laughed at him. Engineers walked out. Newspapers called him a fool. And in moment after moment, where rage or humiliation would have been the natural response, he chose something else. He returned to the internal picture of what he intended to build. He stayed anchored to that image, regardless of what the bank said, what the press printed, or what the economy was doing at the time. Hill studied Ford extensively and concluded that his greatest asset was not mechanical genius. It was emotional architecture. Ford had built an internal structure so stable that external chaos could not find a foothold. Now apply this to your life today. You receive news that your investment dropped. A source of income disappears overnight. A business obstacle appears out of nowhere. In that moment, your emotional intelligence is not a psychological concept. It is a financial instrument with a measurable return. Panic sells at the bottom. Grief costs 3 months of re-entry time. Rage creates 3 new enemies who would have been allies. But the person who waits, who breathes, activates the mental ground wire, and holds the 24-hour rule, positions for the recovery that always follows the disruption. Hill wrote that every adversity carries with it the seed of an equivalent benefit. The seed is there. You will never find it while you are running. Thomas Edison lost an entire laboratory to fire in 1914. Decades of notes, prototypes, and irreplaceable work, gone in one night. He was 67 years old. His response, documented by his son, who stood beside him watching the flames, was this: "Go get your mother and her friends. They will never see a fire like this again. The next morning, he began rebuilding. That is not an inspirational story. That is a trained emotional architecture operating under maximum pressure. Hill cited that night as one of the purest demonstrations of the philosophy in real life. You do not build that in a crisis. You build it in the quiet moments before one arrives. Here is the final truth that most prosperity teachers are afraid to say. Sometimes the most powerful financial decision you can make is no decision at all. Hill called this controlled inaction. It is not avoidance. It is not procrastination. It is the deliberate conscious choice to withhold action until the emotional static clears and strategic intelligence can operate cleanly. The financial world has a name for the opposite of this: trading on emotion. And every serious investor will tell you it is the fastest and most reliable path to loss. Good abandonment, the ability to release the compulsion to act, to let a situation breathe, to trust the intelligence that operates below the noise, is one of the most sophisticated skills a financially serious person can develop. It is also one of the most spiritually grounded. The psalmist's instruction to be still was not written during peaceful times. It was written in the middle of collapse. Enemies closing in, everything threatening to fall apart at once, and in that specific moment of pressure, the prescription was not action, it was stillness. 2 words. 3,000 years later, those 2 words still carry more financial wisdom than most best-selling books on the market today. Hill encoded the same principle into 20 years of research, 500 documented conversations with the wealthiest and most effective people of his era. And the conclusion was always the same. Stillness is the strategy. Napoleon Hill wrote, "The starting point of all achievement is desire. Keep this constantly in mind. Weak desires bring weak results, just as a small fire makes a small amount of heat." But he also taught that desire without mastery of the emotional self is fire without a hearth. It burns everything around it without warming anything. Here is the metaphysical resolution. Your emotions are not your enemy. They are messengers. The discipline is not to silence them. It is to govern the timing of your response to them. Wealth is not built in the moment of action. It is preserved in the moment of restraint. The billionaire's silence is not emptiness. It is the most powerful form of strategic positioning a human being can occupy. Every great fortune Hill documented had a moment, usually several, when the person chose stillness over reaction, patience over panic, and vision over fear. That choice is available to you right now, not next year, not after the next crisis passes. Now, this is the law, this is the philosophy, and this is your invitation. If this teaching shifted something in the way you see wealth, emotion, and discipline, you are exactly the person this channel was built for. Subscribe to Napoleon Hill Wealth Code and join a growing community choosing to build their minds with the same intention they bring to building their finances. Every week, we go deeper into the principles the wealthiest minds in history actually used, not the surface version. The real philosophy, applied to the real world you are living in today. Your wealth is not determined by the market. It is determined by the mind that responds to it. And Napoleon Hill said it best. Whatever the mind can conceive and believe, the mind can achieve. Be still, be deliberate, be wealthy,